Welcome everyone to Warlock Games Character Creation Forge. I'm your host, Matthew Pauze, a paid GM at startplaying.games.com as OniWolf2000, and today we'll be learning Cyberpunk Red. Here to teach us today is Rob. Why don't you tell us about yourself, Rob?
Hey everybody, I'm Rob. I go by DM Raw on startplayinggames.com. I'm also a paid GM over there. I've got decades of experience playing games and running games. I've been running them since I was a teenager, and Cyberpunk Red is just one of the games that I run. I also do a lot of D&D, fifth edition and Pathfinder, and other versions of Pathfinder or older D&D and whatnot.
Alright, so for the audience, we're going to get into the setting of Cyberpunk a little more after we do the character creation. But where do we start, Rob?
Where we start with Cyberpunk is that we are learning Cyberpunk Red, which is sort of the third version of Cyberpunk that our Telsorian Games has put out in the last few decades. The first one, Basic Cyberpunk, was sort of set in an alternate version of Earth in 2013. The second version, Cyberpunk 2020, came out maybe 10 years or so after the first version and was set in the year 2020. Cyberpunk Red now has jumped forward about 25 years and is set in the year 2045. Still sort of the same game setting, and Cyberpunk has got its own world, its own cities, sort of its own culture. The rule system can be used for any sort of cyberpunk or futuristic type of game where there's a lot of technology and internet and hacking and cybernetics and sci-fi action.
Alright, so we're talking about a game that has its own setting. This isn't a genre based system, it's a drilled down, established setting.
It is an established setting, but it is also its own genre. Like there really aren't any other cyberpunk games that go by that name. There are a lot of other systems that can be cyberpunked
Mm-hmm.
in the way that you create characters. This is sort of the only one that's got that official title.
Okay. So I am looking at the PDF and it says there's three ways to make a character. Which of these three are we going to dive into today?
We are going to do sort of a little bit of a mix of the second and the third option. So we should probably go over the three different ways of making a character. The first way is the street rat character creation, and it's very sort of cookie cutter. Like you can make a character in 5 minutes by just selecting a role and assigning stats and skills and equipment, and you just kind of go down the list by the role, and it's all kind of done for you. The only thing you really need to do then is create a name, a personality, and a handle. A handle being sort of like the code name that the character has in the world, because nobody goes by, Bob Jones. They've got another name that they go by, their professional name.
Makes sense.
The Yep, and the second version is called the Edge Runner life path creation style, and it gives you a little bit more flexibility as far as choosing your stats and choosing your skills, and a couple more options for equipment as well. But it's still meant to basically be sort of a streamlined way of creating a character. The third option they call the complete package for the character creation, and then you're going down into the nitty gritty, and you're choosing every skill. You're fine tuning your statistics, and if you wish, doing the life path progress, you can choose each option rather than sort of, because we'll get to the life path system, but the way that they've created characters in Cyberpunk is that they have this life path system, which allows you to sort of create the background for your characters, things outside of your statistics and your skills. It's like where your characters come from, like your background, your family background, if you've got friends, if you have enemies, if you have personal interests, if you have like items, things like that you are sort of attached to. They have this whole thing that's been built into the system since the beginning of Cyberpunk as a game system, where it lets you sort of flesh out this character so that you kind of know who they are in the little details, and it gives you a fast way of doing that.
Alright, sounds good. So we're going to do the second option and kind of start building
Mhm.
there, right? Correct?
Yes, we're going to do a slightly modified version of the second option.
All right, so where do I begin?
Where you begin is first you need to choose a role, and there are, if you're looking through the rules book,
Mm-hmm.
they have under roles they list all the options for, and your role is your character class.
Okay.
um, so uh, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They
So
have 10 different roles.
for the audience at home, the rules are given on page 29 in very short context, and then afterwards expand on that.
Yes. They begin on 29, and then as soon as you go to page 30, they have your role, and uh, each one has its own abilities. Each role has a basically a skill that is tied to that role that only that role can have. And although there is a rule system for multi-classing, there's no in the basic rules they don't encourage you to multi-class coming right out of the gate. It's not a sort of a beginner type of um, character creation process.
All right. So as the person learning to make the character, I think we're going to go with the executive, the exec.
All right,
So what do I need
the
to know
exec.
from
So
this?
it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
The executives in the cyberpunk world. So uh, in the future of cyberpunk, corporations are basically the governments of the future. The government, as we know it now around the world, has sort of lost its power to uh, the money and the influence of multinational corporations that have become so large that they almost operate independently. And in a world, if you would say that there's sort of like a villain in the world, execs almost fall into that sort of role kind of by default because they work for the enemy in a way. Cyberpunk is all about uh, standing up to this world that is run by these corporations that are not necessarily altruistic. Although there can be execs that try to work from within to make things better for the world. It's not always the case. Most cyberpunks are just trying to get by. They're trying to get to their next paycheck. They're trying, not street. It's a bit more about survival than it is about changing the world globally.
All right.
And the
We'll
heroes tend to be more anti-hero than hero.
Makes sense. We'll dive more into the setting as we go. So I've taken the role exec and the role ability teamwork. And where do I go from here?
We'll get back to teamwork in a moment.
Okay.
So now that you've sort of chosen your role, we'll go to the character creation method.
Okay.
And that begins down on page 41.
All right.
And that's where you they have like this chart, this little easily referenceable chart where you can start at number 1 and go down, by the numbers, number 1, number 2, number 3, where you are selecting your role and your life path and your statistics and whatnot. You've already done number 1. Number 1
All
was to
right.
pick the role, and you did that with the exec. Then we go to number 2, which is to run your life path. In Cyberpunk, the life path, like we had talked about, that's sort of like your background. It's not necessarily skills related. It doesn't have like a statistical effect on the game other than to encourage role playing and flesh out a character.
All right.
And the life path begins down on page 45.
All right.
And what I like to do with the life path is when I create characters using the Edgerunner system, I like to have the roll or choose option for each one of these. If you really have no idea what sort of character you want to make, you can roll a d10 on any one of these charts and just assign it to your character. And that way, some of these things are beyond your control. But I like to give the option of like, if you roll something that just doesn't make sense or you're not comfortable with, then you can choose something that you think is, or you could roll again.
All
I
right.
sort of see it as like divination. You're like rolling the bones to see what the past and the future of your character might be. So the first one we get to on this is cultural origins, And this is basically where your character is from. And it's not necessarily like if your character is from, for instance, like the South. If it says South Asian, it doesn't necessarily mean that your character is South Asian. It could just mean that that's where you grew up and that's your cultural ties.
All right.
This is one that I like to encourage people to select on their own. Just because in the modern world, it's a little. This is a chart that has existed in this system for decades, and I think in sort of with the way that modern people look at cultures, it can be a little bit tone deaf sometimes.
That's fair. I will
So
go.
this is where you would roll a d10, or you would choose one.
Well, I'll roll the d10 just for the sake of the podcast and people's interests. And I have Western European. So is there somewhere on this sheet to put that?
Let's take a look at your sheet real quick. There should be. There should be a life path section on your sheet.
All right, so here we are, cultural origins.
It looks like it's right there on the left-hand side. Yep.
We have rest.
Looks like you are using the Roll20 or a version of the Roll20 character sheet.
To my knowledge, this is the official sheet. It's a fillable sheet produced by the company who makes the game. I could be wrong.
Yes, I think that, and they partnered with Roll20, I believe, to put that in there. So if you're creating a Cyberpunk game and you use Roll20 as your VTT, then if you create it as a Cyberpunk game and select Cyberpunk Red as your character sheet option, something very similar to this is going to show up. And it's very easy to fill out. It does a lot of the work for you.
Well, that's good. Today we just have the fillable sheet, so...
All right.
All right, so there's a number of these charts.
Along with cultural...
Yeah.
Along with cultural origins, you also get an additional language that you choose from a list. So which one did you choose again? Or which
we went
did
with
you roll?
Western European. And the options
so
granted by the book are Dutch, English, French, German, Italian, Norwegian, Portuguese, or Spanish.
Yes, and you just choose one of those, and you have that as a secondary language automatically.
All right. And does the sheet note that somewhere?
There should be a languages option near skills somewhere, I believe, or maybe you can just put it in notes. Or you just put it right with the life path. That would make the most sense, probably.
All right, there is languages under skills, so I'm going to be boring and choose English. So we have that set. Is there anything else I need to do with our origin, or do we move on to the next?
We move on to the next one. Now that your cultural origins have been chosen, you basically just go down the list here that they have, and the next one on the list is your personality. This is again something it's always these charts you will roll a d10. Or you look down the list and you choose one.
All right, so
if you want to go just hardcore, you just roll the d10, and then you're kind of forced into things that maybe you're not used to playing. But I find that they sometimes these choices, when they're made for you, bring out things in a character that you never would have thought of doing. And this is what I love about the life path system.
Absolutely. Today I'm going to do, normally in a game I'd put a little more thought into this, but for the sake of the audience and for a little fun, I'm just going to randomize them all. So we have a 3, which makes his personality arrogant, proud, and aloof.
Yes. Other options in these, since the audience here isn't able to see this chart that we've got, other options would be like shy and secretive, rebellious. You can have picky and fussy. Somebody who's stable and serious, or silly and fluff-headed. There's lots of options. They kind of run a pretty wide gamut, like 10 different options, of course, for every thing that you would roll on these charts, and they are pretty well thought out. Now that you've chosen that, we go down to the next one, and that would be your dress and personal style. And again, there's 2 options here, so the chart doesn't show you exactly that you should roll twice, but I always think that you should. One for clothing style and one for hairstyle.
So we have a 6 and a 10.
6 would be bohemian, which is folksy, retro, free-spirited. And then you would roll again for your hairstyle.
Yes, and for that we have a 10, which is long and straight by this chart.
Yep. They have all sorts of options in here. And again, this is one of those ones where I think some people they have an idea for their character, and And sometimes they don't choose the one that's rolled for them, and they like to just say, I'm going with bald or mohawk or whatever. The next chart we've got is for the affectation that you are never without. And this is sort of just like a little quirk that your character might have. You've got some sort of object that is like, part of your character in a way. And for instance, like Arnold Schwarzenegger's hardly ever seen without a cigar. So that would be like his affectation. In half of the films action films he's done.
All right, so we got a 3. So ritual
3
scars.
Which is weird. I mean, an affect. I don't know if the scars are really considered an affectation. You can't really remove them. But
yeah, they're kind of a permanent thing.
In Cyberpunk, nothing's permanent.
Oh, okay.
The technology has advanced far enough that scars can be easily removed.
That's good to know.
Going down to your next options, you get down to the next page. Now we're on page 48, and you've got your motivations and relationships.
All right,
there's
quite a few charts here.
What was that?
Quite a few charts here.
Yeah, quite a few on this page. They're all a little bit related. So the first one you would be rolling is the thing that you value most in the world. And it's not necessarily an object. It could be an idea, too. The options here are things like honesty, knowledge, vengeance, love, power, family.
So we have a
what did you roll?
6 and then an 8. So vengeance for the first one of these charts.
And the next part of that chart is how do you feel about most people, and that's what you rolled the 8 on.
Yep.
And that is people are untrustworthy, don't depend on anyone. So how you feel about people is you don't trust them, basically.
All right, starting to sound like a character that fit well in this world.
Other options on that second chart for how you might feel about people are neutral, or you like people, or you hate people. There's a pretty big spectrum of how you might feel about people in general. And these are things I think in a lot of other games people really don't consider. Like, how does your character, in like a D&D game, most people don't really think about this stuff.
It really depends on the system, and as we build more on the character creation forge, I'm sure we'll see a lot of games, some that have these unique charts and some that the personality is completely left up to in the actual moment.
Yeah. And of course, in Cyberpunk, with the way that I run it, I think these things can be either rolled or chosen if you have a really specific idea.
Absolutely.
But I think they're nice to have in a game. I kind of I love life path generators, and there's life path generators for other games online. Everybody's kind of done a version of them over the years. But Cyberpunk is just one of those few games that's got their own built-in.
All right, so
moving on to the next. Yep. We have the things. Yeah, well, we're still on the same page, still on 48, and we're looking at now the things that you value most. Your most valued person in your life would be, and you roll a d10.
And I got a 10 for that chart and a 1 for the next one.
So the person you value most in the world is no one on your 10. And the most valued possession that you own, you said you rolled a 1?
Yep.
That would be a weapon.
Yeah.
So either a gun or a sword or a bazooka, who knows?
Yeah, it's really starting to shape up to a... It's interesting whenever you use these random charts, you really start to get an image of an individual, even though it's 100% randomized.
Yeah. That's why I like these charts. Sometimes they spark like a piece of your character that you may not be thinking of in character creation. So for you, what do you think the weapon would be? So I think this is kind of the interesting part of character creation. This is where you get to decide what would that weapon be. What's the weapon that your character values? As an executive, it could be up to anything.
Yeah, he is an executive. He dresses very retro. He's got long straight hair. He values vengeance. He trusts no one. He doesn't like anyone. I'd almost say a knife. It's a very close personal weapon. It is not something... It is something you can hide easily. And at the same time, it's not really glamorous or anything, but it's always there.
Yeah, that sounds like a good option. Something very... So for another character, it might be a gun.
Yeah.
I had a character in a game that I ran last week who was playing a rocker boy, and he decided that right off the bat he wanted to basically spend all of his money to buy a rocket launcher and hide it in his guitar case. sort of like El Mariachi style.
Mm.
And that was sort of like his stick. Like he had this rocket launcher hidden away that he could pull out if he really needed it. And funny enough, in the first game, he pulled it out. Of course,
Well, yeah, no point buying
didn't
something
take
if you're not
very
going to
long.
use it.
Yeah, if you're not going to use it, why have it?
So it looks
All
like our
right,
next.
moving on.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, ahead. Go ahead.
It looks like our next chart is your original family background.
Yes. Now there are sort of two background charts. The first one here for your family is not so much how you grew up, although it can affect that, but it's more like the history of your family, like where you come from in general. So go ahead. There's obviously there's the one option here, and you would roll a d10,
Yep.
and you get what?
I've got an 8. So mega
And
structure worn rats. What is that?
so you grew up in basically a giant complex of apartment structures, sort of like the projects, and it's where people who live in the big city that don't have a lot of money are forced to reside in the cyberpunk world. There are places in the real world that are very. We have places nowadays that
That
exist like
emulate
this.
that.
There are projects. There was a very famous one over in, I think in Hong Kong, that had grown up. I think they called it the Walled City or something like that, and it had grown, and like multiple apartment buildings had sort of been crammed in together. It was modified over the years, and it's just a lot of people living in very close proximity.
All
And there
right.
is a good explanation here too. They do give a description in the book of what these things mean. So I'll give the description of what the megastructure Warren Rats is.
Yeah.
So you grew up in one of these huge new megastructures that went up after the war. So there was a war about 25 years ago. So when they say new, 25 years ago is not really new, I think, in the cyberpunk world. But they are tiny apartments.
Mm-hmm.
You basically ate whatever you could get for food. They talk about kibble and scrap. Kibble being basically being one step up from dog food. And so you mostly had a warm bed, but maybe not always. And you learned from an adult rather than like going to school. And it's possible that there was a school in this place, but it was sort of a little bit informal.
All right. So moving on, the next seems to be the childhood environment we grew up in.
Yes. So this is where things can kind of change a little bit. So
Mm-hmm.
you may have started in this megastructure, but now we're going to find out if that's where you stayed as a child.
All right. So I
Uh,
got a 3 on this particular one, which is a Normid pack moving from place to place.
yes, nomads. So nomads are a thing in this game, and they're a lot like in the world of like Mad Max. You've got these tribes of people that don't really have homes, and they move around. Surviving by taking odd jobs in different places, and just going wherever the work and the food is.
Which
So you may have
makes
started in
sense.
one of these giant megastructures, but you were probably part of a group of people that had moved into this structure and either stayed there for a while before they moved on, or maybe they moved from part to part within these megastructures. They're large enough so that they're almost a city in themselves. And
Okay.
this is where you can kind of say, well, did this character stay in? Did he really grow up in this megastructure, or was he born there and then eventually moved out with the tribe? And I would think that because you've chosen the nomad pack, that maybe you moved from place to place.
Well,
That
going with
also means that you've got family kind of everywhere.
makes sense. Going with the next one, Family Crisis, I rolled an 8, which is your family scattered to the winds due to a misfortune.
Yeah. So this is one thing that in Cyberpunk, families are always in crisis. In the blurb here in the book, basically says that in the time of the Red, the world is still recovering from a world war and a bunch of other disasters, and the chances are that something happened to you or your family that affects kind of where you are now. And when you rolled this 8, it's very appropriate. You started in this megastructure, you moved in with a tribe of people, and over time, your family has been scattered about to different places. They've gone wherever the work is, and that doesn't always mean they can take the family with them.
Makes sense with the setting.
Yep. And since it says it was due to misfortune, just means that there was no money and no work. sort of grew up like in a sort of Dust Bowl sort of background where you just kind of had to go wherever work existed and family
Mm.
stayed wherever they were.
All right, so we're really starting to
Uh,
get someone coming together here. It seems like we move on next to friends, and that is a
yes.
D10 minus 7.
Yeah. So in the life path version, when you get to friends in Cyberpunk, there is when you roll this d10 and you subtract 7, that determines how many friends you've made in your life.
All right.
So for most characters, you're not going to have any friends. Just the rolls just don't often come up that way. I suggest for this, we decide let's have one friend. That way we get to go work with these charts and see how the friends system works.
All right. So we're going to make a friend no matter what, and it's going to
Yes.
be 3. A teacher or mentor?
Then you basically decide who this teacher or mentor was,
All right.
and it's basically a contact that you have within the game that you can sometimes call on for assistance. Doesn't necessarily need to be like a fleshed out person, but it connects you to other places in the world.
I feel this friend or contact is a mentor who, after his family left and he was abandoned, kind of took them in as a go-between, and this is what brought him into the more executive positions he's at today.
Yeah, this makes perfect sense. You maybe you did a job for an executive who liked the way that you worked and saw potential, and then basically gave you some sort of a job that either put you through school or into some sort of corporate education background, and eventually put you in track to become an executive in your own right.
All
So
right.
that's so then now as a GM, I would say, well, you have a mentor, you have you're a junior executive just starting out, and you have a
Mm-hmm.
senior executive that's in the same corporation who is a contact of yours,
All right. That's
and
a great start.
right away we have story happening.
So it looks like enemies go the same way, where it's a D10 minus 7. Did we want to
It
just
is
assume one enemy, and just so the audience can see what this looks like?
exactly. Let's do one enemy so that we can show how these work as well. Enemies are more complex than friends,
Yes, I see
so
it
you will
takes
roll
3
three
roll.
times on this. Yeah,
Yeah.
three times on this chart.
So we have a 6, a 3, and a 6.
So your enemy is a person that you work for. So someone else in your corporation, uh, you've made an enemy of, or they consider you their enemy. The second chart would say who caused it and who's been wronged. You can choose this, or you can roll again.
Well, like I said, I rolled a 6, a
The
3,
chart
and a
says to
6.
choose. 6 of 3 would be that this person or you caused them a public humiliation. So what would you say for your character? How do you wish to go with this? You have this person that you worked for. Did they humiliate you? Did you humiliate them?
I
What
think
would you?
I humiliated them. Working for my mentor, I ended up
Mhm.
probably stealing some of this guy's information or stuff and delayed his project so that my mentor's project was released first, making this guy look like a bit of a
That's
fool,
good.
but really making him dislike me.
Got it. Got it. Now we get to the point where so we've now determined who your enemy is and what caused it. Then you go to look at the last part of this chart, and your last roll was what again?
A 6.
A 6. So this person has an entire gang that they can throw against you, which is 1d10 plus 5 people.
Mm-hmm.
So whoever this person is, they have to work outside the rules of the corporation to get their revenge on you. And it just so happens that they have contacts on the street, which may come back to haunt you at some point. There's a group of people out there that you know. At some point, if you come across them, they may try to get payback.
All right.
Now, there's one last part to the enemies, and that is called Sweet Revenge.
Okay.
And this is the part where you or they, how it's determined how they react or how you react if you encounter them, like in the world. And you can roll again a d10, or you can choose. And since we're
9.
rolling, let's see what
I've
we
got a 9.
9, which would be that you would set them up for a crime or other transgression that they didn't commit. So either so this is your revenge. So you are, we could say that your character is plotting continuously some way to bring about the downfall of this enemy.
All right.
And you're going to do it not directly, but by setting them up somehow,
Mm-hmm.
which works great for corporate life. Corporates
Sounds
don't
like
like to
it.
get their hands dirty. All right, so the next part after your enemies is you go to love affairs. This is another one. It's also you roll a d10 and you subtract 7, and that determines the number of love affairs that you have had.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to just choose one so that we can go through the path again.
Sounds
And
great.
go ahead and roll a d10 and tell me what you get.
So I got a 2.
2 would be your lover mysteriously vanished. So you have one lover,
Mm-hmm.
and they're gone. You don't know what happened to them. They just disappeared one day.
Yeah.
And after years of playing Cyberpunk, for some reason, this one pops up all the time. There's
Oh,
10
really?
options. Yeah, there's 10 options, but this one just seems to like always be the one that pops up, and I don't know why.
Strange coincidences.
Makes it easy for the game master, because they're like, well, person disappeared. We can solve that mystery later.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a great thing, because then now your character has something, has a mystery built in. There's a goal, that one of your lovers has vanished, and whether or not you're currently seeking them, it's something that can pop up later in the game. It's a motivation built in.
Absolutely, and those are fantastic.
Yes.
Speaking of
All
motivations,
right, the last. Oh, yep. Go ahead.
speaking of motivations, the next one looks like life goals.
Yes, life goals is sort of this is the last one, and I usually suggest that players choose a life goal, but let's roll and see what happens.
We have a 9.
9 is to gain fame and recognition. Again, this is another one that works very well with executives.
Absolutely.
And another example of the game sort of working to your advantage and divining a future that somehow makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. So the next part of this is when we get to the actual character building and statistics. And give me 1 second, and I'm just going to bring up I have my own chart, because the book is a little heavy and there's a lot of different places to go as far as building characters. So I've made sort of a streamlined chart of my own to help me
Absolutely.
get through it.
For the audience, this book is about 450 pages, as opposed to our last video, which was a book based on a 50-page RPG.
Yes, a lot of the Cyberpunk Red book is background and information on the world. So if all of that was stripped away, the book would be significantly smaller. But there is a whole lot of history to this book, and there's a whole lot of history to the world that has kind of been added to over time. Every time they update this game, they have more history that they like to add in. And for those people who are playing the video game Cyberpunk 2077, a lot of the history in this book is taken into account in that game. So that is the next evolution of Cyberpunk with this world. All right. Let's get down to the statistics and how you choose them. There are a group of statistics in this. They're probably a little bit more than most games have. There are 10 stats, and one of them is a stat that we'll get to in a moment called luck, which sort of exists a little bit separately and acts differently than the rest of the statistics. The game breaks them down into 3 groups. You have a mental group, which is your intelligence and your willpower, your cool and your empathy, and a brief introduction to what those are. Your intelligence is straightforward. It's kind of what you know and how smart your character is. Your willpower is your ability to sort of resist influences. Your cool is sort of like your personality. And cool is what you roll when you're persuading people and just being cool in general. Empathy is how you relate to other people. Empathy allows you to sense like what other people are feeling. It also determines your own empathy towards the world. So the lower your empathy is, the closer you become to having sort of like dissociative mental problems. And if you get below like 2 in empathy, then you start heading towards what's called cyberpsychosis, which can turn you into a psychopath.
Oh,
And there are rules in this game that are based on empathy and cybernetics, and taking, like, for instance, you can have like mental traumas that can reduce your empathy as well, or drugs that can make you lose control. And we'll get to that in a moment. The next group is your combat group of statistics, and they put technique in there, which is, although I wouldn't really call it a combat skill, it can sometimes be used for like explosives and other things, but it is a skill that has to do with tech and just fixing things and using technology.
okay.
The other skill in combat is reflexes, and reflexes is how quick you are, and it determines uh, a lot of ranged combat successes. Then you have your physical group, and that has to do with sort of that's your body, which is when you take your body and you combine it with your willpower. There's a chart that tells you how many hit points you have. Your body also is the stat that you roll for if you get injured to a certain point. You roll that to see if you stabilize or if you get worse. The next stat is dexterity, and dexterity is used in melee combat for the most part. And then you have your movement, which is a stat all on its own. So you can be faster on your feet or slower depending on how many points you have in movement. The
Okay.
last skill is luck. And luck is the one that I was talking about, is a little strange, and it doesn't really exist in a lot of other gaming systems. And the way that luck works in Cyberpunk is that you have this pool of points, which is the represented by your luck stat,
Mm-hmm.
anywhere from 2 to 8. And as far as game mechanics work, you can apply points from luck to offset die rolls in your favor. And this pool, it refills at the beginning of every new game. So you have that number of points for a session that you can basically use however you wish. Like if you're getting into combat and you're in a bad position and you really want this shot to hit, you can throw a lot of luck points into it, and that can make a big difference in skill rolls and combat rolls. But once that luck is gone, it's gone for that game.
All right. So looking at it, it looks like we have multiple charts here for different roles.
Yes, so that is if you are using the Street Rat version, then you
Okay.
can look at those charts, and that determines what your stats are. So if we were doing the simple version, the Street Rat, that is sort of the cookie cutter version of, you don't really have to think, you don't have to
Mm-hmm.
apply stats, you just choose the array that fits with the role that you've chosen.
Oh,
We're going to
so
do the
okay.
second package, which is a little bit of a mix of that. It gives you a little bit more leeway to have your stats unique.
Okay.
I'm going to jump down to that.
Mm-hmm.
Where is it? It is. So there is a chart for adding statistics, and you get a certain number of stat points depending on sort of like the heroic level of your game. Um,
Okay, so we're
if you
looking at
are
method
a
three, which is the complete package, right?
Yes, this is where I like to kind of go off the off of the complete package, even though we're doing basically the Edge Runner package. I like
Mm-hmm.
to do the complete package for stats because I think that makes a big difference for characters. Stats,
That's
I think,
fair.
having, different than everybody else, I like that. And
Okay. For
you should note that stats have to be within 2 to 8 range.
mm-hmm.
There are again 10 stats, and for a starting character, you would have 62 stat points to assign for those stats.
And
And
is
what
it
they
a
suggest
one-to-one cost or?
is a 1-to-1 cost. So if you're looking at your stats and you see you have 62 stat points, you have 10 stats, that means that your average stat is going to be 6, and then you've got 2 points left over for your primary stat, which would be an 8. And what I like to do is say, let's start there, choose your primary stat, throw that at 8, the rest of your stats are at 6, and then you can sort of just, kind of push and pull some stats if you think that your character should be a little bit better at something or a little bit worse at something else.
All right, that's interesting. Is it the same for the two lesser methods? Do they add up to 62 with them, or is it a little more random with them?
They all start at 62, I believe.
Okay. It's certainly an interesting system, and if I was playing this long term, I would definitely go with that. For the sake of brevity and keeping the show reasonably short, I'm going to go with one of the pre-made ones. Is that all right?
That's fine.
All right.
That's a good place to start. I mean, the reason that those charts exist too is for the people that don't really understand how the stats work. So
Mm-hmm.
you can just reference those charts and say, well, I don't really know how these, how they apply, but they've pre-built some so that you can look at them and just say, I'm just going to go with this because it makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's
So
quick.
for the people at home, there are a chart for every roll that we've seen, and there's a D10 roll, and the stats vary from one side to the other. So what I've chosen to do is roll a dice. We got a 10, which is going to give us a, I believe it was intelligence reflex of 7. And wow, this sheet auto-populates, which is wonderful. It gives us a dexterity and tech of 5. It gives us a cool of 8, and then a will and luck of 7. Or will and luck
You
of
were using the
6.
executive chart, correct?
Yes. Number
So
10 is
yeah,
what was rolled.
so the yeah,
Uh,
so the chart that you're using comes from the Street Rat version of character creation, which is fine.
oh, okay. Oh, okay. The Edge Runner has a single chart, it looks like. My apologies.
Yes,
So, for.
but I for the purposes of getting through it quick, the
Yep.
Street Rat one is just fine. They're all a little bit, I mean, they're all a little different,
Mm-hmm.
um, but any one of these methods can be used, and they don't you don't need to stick to one. Like as you can
No,
see,
absolutely.
you could use the Street Rat chart if you don't understand the stats and you don't want to worry about assigning.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we've populated the character sheet some with this uh, filling character sheet. I can notice that all the stats for the skills are now filled in as well, and it looks like it's just a blank. What the statistic is automatic bonus to that skill. Is that right?
Every statistic is assigned to a particular skill, and yes, and that sheet does auto populate those, but you still need to put ranks into those skills, which we will get to in a moment. We
All right.
still have two more derived statistics, they call them,
All
which are
right.
statistics that are secondary and related to your primary ones. The first one is your hit points. And
Okay.
like I said, that is a function of your will and your body scores. So, what is your will and what is your body?
It looks like my will is 6 and my body is 4. So I believe it's 35 on this chart.
Yes, you would look at the chart and it tells you that that's 35.
All right.
There's also a math way of figuring it out, rounding up, but the chart makes it easy.
All right. And for
Hit
those.
points basically increase at like 5 point increments.
All right. For those at home, this chart's on page 79 in the book.
The secondary derived stat is humanity, and
Mm-hmm.
humanity is a function of your empathy stat.
All right.
Humanity is a measure of how well you interact with the world and other people, and people with low humanity stats have a lot of problems in human interactions. They could be sociopathic or withdrawn or even homicidal. If your humanity drops below 0, that represents the death of your character's emotional life, and they slide into a state called cyberpsychosis, which is uh, created basically for this game. It's the threshold at which your characters may take too much damage to their humanity, either by stress or through uh, having too many cybernetics implanted. And we'll get to cybernetics in a moment. But
Mm-hmm.
for your humanity, it is a function of your empathy. It is 10 times the empathy stat.
All right. So for our character we're building today, that puts us at 70 humanity to start.
Yes.
So he seems very functional
All
among
right.
people, it would seem, even though he doesn't seem to like them.
Yeah, understanding people maybe is a separate thing to liking them.
Yep.
Maybe you understand them too well.
Fair enough. So where does that lead us to next
All
after
right.
that? We have our base statistics and our derived statistics. We have our history of our character.
Now we go to skills. There are a lot of skills in Cyberpunk. which can be a bit overwhelming especially if you're doing the complete package and you're choosing your skills point for point individually. I think we should probably go with one of the templates, either the edge runner or the street rat, to
All right.
determine what your skills are.
So the skills start on page 81, it looks like. Where do we find these templates?
Templates are down on page 86. We'll start with
86.
street rat just to make this go quick.
Absolutely. How about you explain to me how Street Rat works, and while I'm plugging those in, you can explain to the audience the other two steps.
So the street rat template, it lists 20 skills that a role would have, and it gives sort of the what they would assume a normal character of that role would have in a certain skill. So, for instance, with the executive, I'll jump down to the executive chart, which is down on page 87.
Mm-hmm.
And you would look at their list. There's 20 skills listed there down on executive, and it lists the skill, and it lists right next to it the level that you would have that skill at. Beginning skills start at 2 with a max of 6.
All
So an
right.
executive would have an athletics skill of 2, they'd have brawling of 2, they'd have a concentration skill of 2. Their conversation skill is 6. And conversation in this game is interesting. It's a little bit like gathering information. It's not used um, maybe in the way that you might think. I've never seen a system that has a conversation skill before. They sort of lump them in typically with persuasion or some other interactive skill.
All right.
But that's what conversation is in Cyberpunk. They also have a high education of 6. They've also given them a high evasion skill of 6. Their first aid is low at 2. The human perception, which is an empathy skill, which is that's where you're getting an idea, like a feel for what someone is thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So in D&D, that would be like your sense motive skill. That's high for an exec at 6. They have street slang at 2. They have local expert, which is that's a skill knowing about your local area of 2. Perception is 2. Persuasion is 6. Stealth 2. Accounting through accounting, bureaucracy, business, deduction, even handgun and lip reading. Those are all at 6. You're skilled in those. And then they have a personal grooming skill of 4. And this is also the only game systems I've seen where they have a skill for how well you and how well your personal grooming habits might be. And it can come in quite often in this game because it's a game that's about style. Cyberpunk is right from the beginning. They say take it to the edge, style over function, and making an appearance and standing out from the crowd.
Mm-hmm. So while I plug these numbers in and find them on our sheet, did you want to explain to the audience the second method and how they do skills?
The second method for Ed Runner, they call this the fast and dirty skills, is you get a number of skill points. They suggest 86 skill points to start to distribute between your character's skills. And they also have a chart that lists typical skills for the role that you've chosen. And there are 20 on that list. And they say, they give you the hot tip that if you notice, because there's 20 skills in this chart, you can divide up your 86 points by 20, and you get an average of 4 skill points per skill that you have in that chart. And that leaves you 6 extra skill points left over to pump into those skills. And I like to say that you can also pump it into skills that maybe even aren't in your role, or not typically within your role. This is why I like the Edge Runner version of character creation, because it lets you have a few skills that might fall outside the normal parameters of whatever your role might be. Like maybe you're playing an executive, but you've decided that you're interested in learning heavy weapons, and heavy weapons is not a skill that executives normally have. Or drive, like driving cars. Most execs don't drive their own cars. They have drivers. Maybe you've decided to learn how to drive.
All right, and does that cover the second method?
That pretty much covers the second method. The third method is similar to the second method. You get 86 points, but you don't have to go by any chart. You're just going through the entire skill list, and you are selecting the skills that you want that you think fit your character, with a minimum skill rank of 2 and a maximum skill rank of 6.
All right.
Should also be noted that there are a few skills that are marked with a ×2 modifier next to them, and those skills cost twice as many points to increase. They are skills that are considered difficult to master, so they are twice as hard to learn.
All right, and those are the ones that are in bold, I'm guessing?
No, they'll be listed with a ×2 next to it. So, for
Okay.
instance, I don't know if the executive has any.
Oh, martial
The
arts.
executive doesn't have any. Yeah, martial arts is one, but that's not on your list.
No. I was just looking for
Yes,
the audiences.
martial arts is one. There's also electronics and security technology is a skill, and that's a double. Paramedic, which is an advanced version of first aid. So first aid exists separately from paramedic. Paramedic is harder to learn. That's a double. And there's a skill called auto fire, which is when you are using weapons and you decide to go fully automatic with your weapon, you don't use the weapon skill that applies to that weapon. You use the auto fire skill, which is separate.
Absolutely. Okay.
And of course, harder to master.
So it looks like we've got all of these skills put in from the first method.
Your skills are all done then? We'll move on to the next part.
Yes, what's the next part to building a character in this system?
Next part is to select your weapons and your armor.
Okay.
With the Street Rat version, this is mostly already determined for you. In the book, they first start by sort of giving a brief explanation on page 91, 92 about weapons and armor, and sort of like what the typical weapon and armor looks like, before they get down to how this is assigned to characters. And let me jump down real quick.
Right. And where do we find how they're assigned?
Let me get there real quick. So they give you a lot of info before they actually get to how they're assigned. Down on page 98 is where you get the first chart for when you are using either the Street Rat or the Edge Runner versions of creating a character. And again, there's another chart, a chart for each role, and you look at that chart and it helps you choose basic equipment. So for an executive, you have a very heavy pistol, you have 50 rounds of ammunition, you have a light armor jack body armor, which is basically light armor that covers your entire body except for your head. And then you have a helmet, which is for your head. And those are listed with a stopping power number. Light armor jacks have a stopping power of 11. And in combat, that stopping power is basically how much damage is absorbed when you take damage from weapons. And combat's kind of a little more complicated, but the higher that SP is, the less damage you'll take from like a bullet or a punch even.
All right. And it seems to be, is there a penalty associated with these, or is that different equipment? I noticed on the
a penalty for the armor, you mean?
Yes, I noticed that on our character sheet there's a spot to put that in.
The light armor jack and the light armor jack head armor, neither of them have a penalty. Once you get into heavier armors, then they affect your reflex and I believe your movement rate and your dexterity. So the heavier the armor that you wear, the more it slows you down.
All right.
And that will affect any skills that are tied to those stats. So also a note to make here is that even with the Street Rat or the Edge Runner fast and dirty equipment assignments, you get 500 euro bills. They call them EB. So euro bills are now the money of the future. They went to a European standard at some point in this alternate reality, and that is what you use now for money.
Okay.
And you have 500 of that, which you can spend on additional items or use on cybernetics, or just hold on to it in case you need it in the game.
All right. And we're not going to go too deep into that right now, but for the people at home, where do they find the start of the equipment?
Equipment is way down. So there's basic equipment listed kind of right where in this section around page 90, but
Mm-hmm.
they have an expanded equipment list that starts much further down in the book.
All
Let me
right,
see
like
if I can
it
find
looks
it.
like starting on page 100 and going on, there's a bunch of basic equipment that probably starting characters would want to look into.
Yes, but there is an expanded list that's much further down in the book. So they have the night markets and the night market appendix, which is sort of like the expanded list of weapons and armor and drones and everything else, and that starts way down on page 340.
Mm-hmm.
So once you get to advanced equipment and stuff that's not within normal starting gear, you have to go way down to the night market to see where that stuff is.
Yeah, it also looks like each group from the first two methods also get a starting equipment list. So,
They do. They get starting gear, your outfit,
mm-hmm.
and again, there's a chart there which determines what you start with.
Mm-hmm.
If you were doing the complete package, you would get a certain amount of money, and then you basically go through the night market and you get to pick and choose every item, bullet, cyberware that you want, and that can take quite a while because the list is pretty big.
That's fair. For brevity's sake, I'm just going to draw from this, and so we can keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Because the whole goal of this is so that the audience can build one of these characters and pick out their own things with watching a short video.
Yes.
All right. So, what is our next step after this?
All right. Did you already go through the gearing up chart?
I did.
And did you go through the cyberware chart?
I did not.
So you get your outfit and your gear. You get your weapons, your armor. You get your outfit and your gear, and then you also get cyberware. And they have a chart also for that, which is listed by again by role. And as an executive, your cyberware that you begin with
Mm-hmm.
is either a biomonitor or tech hair. And tech hair
Where do I
basically is
find this chart? I seem to have
that
gotten
is
lost.
we find the page number for that. The only problem with this book is that it's so big and there's so much going on with it that it is hard sometimes to find these documents because it'll go through a bunch of equipment and then it'll list that
Mm-hmm.
page number. 1 second, I'll find it. Here we go. All right, I'm on weapons and armor. Let me jump down. Here. Cyberware. I believe starts down here on where's the chart? Moment here. There's so much that they go through. They like to list all of the equipment options before they tell you what you can get. And I wish that they had done it the other way around.
Is it 117?
Yes, it is. I just found it too. It's on page 117.
All right.
And that is this is again the Street Rat or the Edge Runner Fast and Dirty cyberware outfitting options.
All right.
And for the executive, your cyberware is either a biomonitor or tech hair.
All right.
Tech hair is basically cybernetic that allows you to change your hair color.
All right. And where would that be put? We have a whole chart here for cyber stuff on the last page.
That's where you would put it. And there should also be an HL cost, humanity loss cost.
Mm-hmm.
So this chart basically gives you these options, and it tells you what your humanity loss is going to be for these options. Let's see, it does the work for you. Later on in the game, when you're adding cyberware and you look at the cyberware lists, each option of cyberware that you get installed has its humanity loss as a function of a number of D6. For beginning, they assume that you just take the average of that roll.
Okay.
So for the cybernetics that your executive has, which are, like again, I said, the biomonitor or tech hair, you get a cyber audio suite, meaning that you have cyber ears. You have what's called an internal agent. And the agent in Cyberpunk is basically a futuristic smartphone. And so you have a smartphone built in. You have what's
Okay.
called toxin binders, which allow you to basically resist drugs and alcohol a lot easier than a normal person. Or you could choose nasal filters, which is basically helps you against um, toxins in the air, whether it's gas or uh, smoke or something like that. And the options are all the same amount of humanity loss. So the humanity loss, no matter what you take, is 12, which turns into a -2 to your empathy stat.
All right.
So the more humanity you lose, the further your empathy is degraded. And every fraction of 10 that you drop drops your empathy by 1 point. So even if you just lose
Okay.
two humanity,
That's your
your
first
empathy
point.
would drop from 7 to 6.
All right. All right. I think I've put everything in for that now. Where do we go next?
Next we go to moment. So there's another option, and this is one that's not always chosen in every game, and this is a little bit more advanced, but I should mention it.
Mm-hmm.
They have a part in the rules where they ask, "Are you running out of cash?" Like, for instance, if you want to start a character that has more than just the basic amount of items, even if you use a complete package, you're still limited in funds. But they have this option where you can basically join an organization or sell out to a corporation, or you can work for an organized crime, uh, gang or whatnot, and they give you an extra 1,500 euro bills in just cyberware that you can add. And this is something that in the game is interesting. If people do it, the GM is heavily it's heavily suggested that the GM basically use this against them because they've
Okay.
basically sold out to someone in order to get this extra cyberware, and it comes with its own set of issues. Like in order to get this, they've basically put like a monitor in you. Like the cyberware that you have either has a tracker in it, or it's got like a cutoff switch,
Mm.
or it could even have like like a corneal implant that bomb that can blow up your head if you turn against the people that you have sold out to.
So is this an optional rule or is this a
It's an option.
hard
It's an
coded?
optional rule, but I just wanted to mention it. We're not going to use it in this one because it would
Absolutely.
make things complicated. But there is. I just needed to mention that there was this rule that's built in that I think is interesting.
Okay.
All right, now that's at this point we have pretty much made your character. You have your
Okay.
cybernetics, you have your skills, you have your items, and you have your background. This character is now ready to go.
Okay. So now that we've got the character creation out of the way, we have a full sheet, and we'll post a link to this character when this video goes live. I have a few questions about Cyberpunk Red itself. You seem to know the system very well, so it's probably best to ask you. For the
Mhm.
actual mechanics of the game, it's looking now. I have not read the book, so I could be way off. That you basically roll. What are you doing? Are you rolling a dice and adding your stat and level together, or are you rolling that many dice? What is the base mechanic for Cyberpunk Red?
The base mechanic for Cyberpunk Red is you only really need two dice. You need a D10 and you need D6s.
Okay.
The D10 is rolled for any sort of skill check,
Mm-hmm.
and you would roll that. For instance, if you were going to roll a firearms check, if you were going to shoot someone,
Mm-hmm.
that is a reflex skill. So you'd roll a d10, you would add your reflex stat to it, and you would add the skill in handgun on top of that.
All right.
And whatever that number comes up to is that's how well you've shot. For instance, for combat, they have charts for every type of weapon at range that you can look at very easily to determine what the difficulty is to successfully hit someone in combat.
Okay.
For skills, there is an opposed system. So if you are using a skill opposed to another person that also has a skill that would oppose it, you would roll your d10 plus your stat plus your skill versus that person's d10 plus their stat plus their skill to see if there is success.
And
There's not a whole lot of modifiers in the game
mm-hmm.
until you are wearing like heavier armor. Then some of your skills might be reduced, and then there are some really minor options for penalties that come up, but they've tried to streamline it so that there's not this huge list of, are you doing this, are you doing that, like they wanted to make it pretty quick so that there was not a
So
whole lot of hunting and pecking to see if there's a +1 here or a -1 there.
the basic mechanic is a D10 plus level plus stat versus a difficulty number or versus an opponent's roll. Is that
They
correct?
call it a difficulty value, the DV.
That's fair. A lot of systems use a similar thing, they just have different names for it. So that's
Yes.
the base system. So as someone who's run this game, I'm sure many times, what are two things that Cyberpunk Red does better than any other RPG system you've run? The two things that you want to highlight of this is amazing of how this system does it.
I think the skill system is pretty amazing because it's so simplified, and they've streamlined it since they first came out with this game. It used to be that everything was an opposed roll, and that can slow things down when you're in combat, especially like you're rolling and then you're waiting to see if the defense roll comes up. In Cyberpunk Red, they've limited defensive rolls to, in combat, for instance, they've limited to people that have their reflexes maxed out. So you can only roll a defensive skill if your reflexes are an 8. And then you would be rolling like your reflex plus your evasion. And the interesting thing is that might not always be a better roll than the base DV in combat. So you may walk into a gunshot if you are using that. So I like that there's just two things. There's the stat, there's the skill, and there's the D10. And very little else kind of goes into determining success or failure. They also have a quick and dirty rule for cover, which most other games don't. Cover doesn't give you a bonus to not being hit. It's either if you can't see somebody, if they have cover, you can't shoot them. And but they have a system for shooting cover, so you can destroy their cover. I mean, weapons in Cyberpunk, you have guns, you have grenades, you have many options to basically destroy the cover that they are hiding behind. And I think that in the games that I've run, it has run pretty quickly. Like people just they won't try to shoot cover away because it's just not worth it. So you are trying to run around and you're trying to get to an angle where you can shoot at somebody and also not be shot at yourself.
All
It makes the
right.
game more fluid. It lets you use the battleground more often. A lot of other games kind of end up as like these toe-to-toe slugfests where you run up and you're just rolling dice against each other until you're dead.
So
And,
those are the so between cover and combat and skills, those are the two things that this really highlights in this game.
I think so, and the skills too. Once you, it seems like a lot because there are a lot of skills, but once
Not really.
you have these, well, once you have them down on your character sheet, it's really easy to see reference, and you just, especially if you're using like Roll20 and an interactive character sheet, you just click it and you're good to go, and it happens fast.
All right. So with that out of the way, something I've been asking people as well. What are two things that you find Cyberpunk Red doesn't handle well?
One thing that I've found that it doesn't quite handle well is heavier weapons.
Okay.
And a critical system. So in the older systems for Cyberpunk, they had a system for criticals and fumbles. If you rolled a 1, that was considered a fumble, and you had a chart that you could roll on your fumble chart depending on if you were using a skill or if you were in combat. They don't really have that anymore. They have sort of like a penalty system, but it doesn't. It's not intuitive. It's not easily accessible, and it slows the game down if you really try to delve deep into what. And the fumbles don't exist the way they used to. The criticals also, I think, are not as they're not as intuitive because in most other systems, your critical is tied into how well you roll on your attack. In Cyberpunk, your criticals are determined on how well you roll on damage. So if and determined by the number of 6s that you roll in doing damage. So a base weapon, like a heavy pistol, does 3d6 damage. The only way that you can crit is if you roll 2 6s out of those 3d6. Then there's a critical chart, and there is then there are penalties assigned for criticals if you do that. But I found that the criticals they don't come up all that often, and sometimes that can slow down the game where you're just pecking away at people doing 4 or 5 points of damage, and that can take a while when a character has 30 or 40 hit points.
All right. Good to know. So
the other thing that was hard to figure out were explosives and grenades.
Mm-hmm.
They just don't seem to pack the punch. Like you could shoot somebody with a rocket, and if they have like 40 hit points, chances are you're not going to kill them unless you roll
Okay.
a couple criticals on that.
So the
And
heavy
you don't know.
weapons aren't as like, gritty as you'd expect them for the genre.
No, I kind of felt like the heavier weapons need to have more punch to them.
Okay, so combat and weapons aside, how do you feel that Cyberpunk Red emulates the cyberpunk genre? That's what the setting is setting, correct? Like that it's
It
clearly in
is,
that
and
genre.
it is. It's clearly that genre, and it does a really good job, I think, of setting the scene, especially with like shootouts and getting into the action, and for that action running fairly quickly as far as combat goes, and skills as well. I like that it does things that a lot of other systems don't, and gives you the option to do these things, and it's built into the mechanics.
Hmm. Okay, so if we took the system itself, like all the setting that pulled away, do you feel it would hold up in other genres, or do you feel it really has found its place in cyberpunk?
Hmm. That's a good question. I think there are settings that are very similar to cyberpunk. For instance,
Mm-hmm.
like sort of a futuristic sci-fi, like anything that's based off of like anime or whatnot, or even just combat in general. Like if you were running a game that was that you wanted to run something like high paced and action oriented, cyberpunk can easily be used with that if you just strip away the cyberware. The system works just fine without it.
All right. Well, it's been good talking with you, Rob. Thank you for introducing everyone to building a cyberpunk red character
Thank
and
you, Matt.
giving us a quick overview of what the system is like.
All right, great.
Hope, hopefully, we can get on again and do another system. So,
Yeah, I hope so, and I hope some people go out in there and play some Cyberpunk Red. It's a fun game. Like I said, it's high paced, it's fast, and it's fun.
all right. So, just a reminder to the audience I am Matthew. I am the host of Warlock Sanctum Games, and I am a paid GM over at Start Playing. And, Rob, did you want to plug anything?
Yep, I'm Rob. You can call me DM Raw. I'm also over at Start Playing Games. And I also do some artwork and development on the side. You can find me on Instagram at Raw's Workshop, which is just RAHS Workshop. And look for me there and look for me on Start Playing Games.
All right. So, bye, everyone.